As I was mentioning, um, Tiny Toons basically, along with Animaniacs, reintroduced the lustful milk gag back in the 90s. Tiny Toons reintroduced it with to a whole new generation. They reintroduced it through the pilot episode. Strangely, oddly enough, they were able to incorporate it into the episode Europe in 30 Minutes, with Babs melting into a puddle after seeing the royal couple. They did it twice with Plucky. Um, they did it twice with Plucky um, in the Acme Bowl and in Pluck Tracy, and then they did it with Babs. They did it with Babs towards the end of the Christmas special. So, thanks to Tiny Toon Adventures, a whole new generation was introduced to the Lustful Milk Gag and actually found it funny. They actually enjoyed it. And to further that reintroduction, Animaniacs, which came out a few years later, uh, really took the concept in on as their own. Um, Dot Warner, one of the main three, reintroduced it or introduced it into Animaniacs for the first time, as well as reintroduced it or helped reintroduce it to a whole new generation. Dot Warner um, did that in the 11-minute short Space Probe. She did it when some aliens who had abducted her, uh, basically were visually showing her thoughts on a screen, and she came up with a thought with her on top of a shoulder or arm of a muscle-bound Mel Gibson, it looked like. And by looking at this and seeing this, she melted into a steaming puddle of goo or a steaming pile of goo, with only her ears and flour, her head flour and ears on top of the goo. Now she was able to reform herself, but still she was the first one in Animaniacs, as far as I know, chronologically, that had introduced this concept. Then of course you have Minerva Mink, who kind of made it her own in a sense, with her animated shorts Moon Over Minerva and Meet Minerva. Now in Moon Over Minerva, she had when she saw Wilfred Wolf's werewolf alter ego for the second time, she melted into a multi-cream puddle of goo, if you will, just melted into a multi-cream puddle. And it took Wilford in his werewolf state to pick her up like a wet towel and wring her out, if you will, like a wet towel to reform her. And I'll get into that in a moment. Now, the second time she did this, she did the lustful milk gag was in Meet Minerva. And this is when she first meets her best friend's cousin. And one of the things she does after she goes into her expressional arousal like outtakes is she basically runs into this male mink's arms, or jumps into this male mink's arms, and melts, and then kind of lean backs and melts into a puddle, but literally melting through his hands and his arms. But the way she does it is she splits in half. Like her upper body goes this way, her lower body goes that way, and they all melt into the same puddle. Basically, like I said, her upper body's melting this way into the puddle, and her lower body's melting that way into the puddle. So, that was a unique take on the lustful milk cake itself. Now, unlike Moon over Minerva, she was able to reform herself back from being a puddle. She was able to do that. Now, there is one thing about Tiny Toons and Animaniacs, and even I guess you could say the 1956 Pollyvoo Woos, the ending of that Popeye short with Olive as a melted puddle of butter flowing down a floor. I look at this, and I look at two different ways of seeing the lustful milk egg. I look at it as seeing the lustful milk egg in two different aspects. Um, One, there's the first aspect is the first way you can look at it is like this. When a character melts into a puddle, it takes another character to reform them. In other words, let's go back to Moon over Minerva. Let's go back to Moon over Minerva. Uh, when she melts into a multi-cream puddle after seeing her uh, friend's werewolf alter ego for the second time, her werewolf friend has to pick her up and wring her out like a wet towel just to reform her. Now, let's say, for example, let's say her werewolf friend said, "Okay, I'm just going to leave you like this. Maybe you'll calm down a little bit. I'll come back, reform you, and we can, continue on, normally and all that, right?" Well, if he wanted to, and if the writers wanted to make it a joke, if you will, but let's say the character, the Wilford character, wanted to, he could have walked off, gone and seen a movie, maybe got something to eat, socialized for a little bit, come back 4 hours later, and Minerva would still be lying there in a multicolored puddle state, multi-cream puddle state. Um, and he would still have to reform her by wringing her out like a towel. Now, here's what's funny about this. There's a person on Facebook, and there are several people on Facebook that do this. They basically pose as a fictional character on Facebook, and they kind of they pose as this fictional character, and they kind of address the media or those that follow them as this character. Well, one person on there is posing as Minerva. And as Minerva, they basically said that what happened to her in Moon over Minerva when she melted was the equivalent of taking a nap. That's right. It was basically the equivalent of going to sleep and have to be woken up by somebody else. In other words, when she melted, Wilford basically had to pick her up, wring her out like a towel to reform her. In other words, when he picked her up and wringed her out like a towel to reform her, he was basically picking her up and wringing her out to wake her up from her deep sleep, or from her nap, if you will. So that's one way of looking at this. Another way of looking at this, I guess you could say permanent lustful melt, if you will, that takes somebody to reform you back to normal. Another way of looking at it is how it's used sometimes to end a cartoon. In Pollyvoo Woos, Olive kind of does this when she melts down into the um, flowing puddle of butter that she becomes, and she has these little dry spots appearing at the end as she's flowing down the floor to enter the cartoon. So yeah, eventually she does reform. I'm pretty sure off panel they got Popeye to reform her and all that, so don't worry. But basically, as she ends the Pollyvoo Woos cartoon, she ends it by basically being nothing more than a puddle of of flowing melted butter going down a floor. So that's one way of looking at it, if you will. That's one way of looking at this one way of the lustful milk egg. Basically, it's like a sleeping melt or a permanent melt to where somebody has to basically reform you, wake you back up from your sleep. Uh, Another way of looking at it is when a character, when they do a lustful melt, is able to reform themselves, like Dot did in Space Probe, like Minerva did um, in Meet Minerva. Babs did it in Europe in 30 minutes, and I'm pretty sure she did it in the Christmas special. You know, so the characters are able to do this. Just like that black chicken did, or black hen did, in Sruna Kruna, the Porky Pig short. So, so if the scenario calls for it, the characters are able to do it on their own. And sometimes, if not, it takes, like I say, another character to help them do it. I know that sounds kind of strange and really huh, what does he mean, kind of deal. And I apologize for that, but that's basically how you can interpretate the lustful milk gag depending on how it's used, if you will. Now, ironically, for some odd reason, the lustful milk gag wasn't really used that much after this. Sure, Disney used it a few times, like with Pepper Ann, Weekenders, Lloyd in Space, Recess maybe, and a few others, but they didn't really use it that much. Then, later on, we get into the new century, the 2000s, as well as this new decade, and all of a sudden we start seeing shows using it more. Using the lustful melt even more so, but basically on the equivalent of how it was used back in the 40s and the 50s. For example, there's a cartoon called Splice, and there's one character that does the lustful milk gag as she sees this kind of handsome, like lion-like character coming out of the water, and she, sitting on her beach chair, just melts right into a puddle right there, or just does a lustful melt right there. And that's in a cartoon called Splice. But then, what's even more funny though, is in the night um, is when shows that are based around human characters only uh, actually incorporate the lustful male gag into their programming. Now you might say, well, how is that possible, Brian? It's supposed to be based around human characters. And you're right, it's supposed to be, but they find a way to do it. Give you an example, Captain Flamingo. There's an episode where one of Flamingo's friends has to have help with his voice, his talking voice, to talk to a girl, right? So Flamingo gives him this one, lets him use this one device to get a suave voice, to try out a suave voice, and he has him test out the suave voice on Flamingo's best friend, Elizabeth. And when Elizabeth hears this, she melts into a puddle right there, and the only thing sticking out of the puddle is her two ponytails, and she's basically like any kind of natural puddle is flowing, spreading around, just starting to spread a little bit, flow a little bit, and her ponytails they're like this, are starting to slowly separate from each other because now she's nothing more than a puddle that's doing what it naturally does. Now again, you might think, well, that's based around human characters. Why would they even incorporate it there? They just do. They just found a way to do it. I mean, heck, take a look at Teen Titans, and I'm not talking Teen Titans Go. I'm talking of the original Teen Titans. They had a male character there. They had a male character there get a hug by Starfire, and this hug basically causes this male character to go through a lustful milk gag, if you will. So, you have that. And if that's not enough, if that's not enough, um, you take a look at a show that I just found out about that came out 2 years ago called Groove High. And it's a basically live action animation hybrid show where, it starts off in live action, incorporates a bit of live action throughout, but the flashbacks that are the main focus of the show or the episode are told in animation. And basically, there's this one episode, I don't know what it's called, where the female main character, Zoe, after she's been flirted with and complimented by her best friend, who's in the disguise of another character, if you will, after the best friend in his new alter ego compliments and flirts with her, Zoe basically melts into a puddle of water. That's right, she basically turns all blue, watery like, and she melts into a puddle of water.